When I first moved into the city, I was desperate for a place I could afford. I found a listing for a one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building on the edge of downtown. The rent was cheap, the location was decent, and the landlord seemed eager to have someone move in. I signed the lease without thinking twice. The building was old with creaky floors and faded wallpaper. My apartment, 6A, was on the top floor. The only other unit on my floor was 6B, but the landlord told me it was vacant. He said the last tenant left in a hurry and never came back for their things. I didn't think much of it. I was just happy to have a place of my own. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, set up my furniture, and tried to ignore the constant hum of the city outside my window. But on the third night, I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, heavy, and deliberate. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, but none came. After a few minutes, the footsteps continued down the hall and stopped outside 6B. I peeked through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe someone from another floor. But the next night, it happened again. This time I heard whispering. I pressed my ear to the door and heard a voice, low and raspy, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Let me in. Let me in." I called the landlord the next morning and asked if anyone had moved into 6B. He sounded annoyed and said no. The apartment was still empty. He told me not to worry, that old buildings make strange noises. I tried to believe him. A week passed. The footsteps and whispering continued every night, always stopping outside my door before moving to 6B. I started sleeping with the lights on. I bought a heavy chair and wedged it under the doorknob before bed. But the noises didn't stop. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying my door handle. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened as the handle rattled back and forth. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but before I could hit call, the noise stopped. I waited in silence, barely breathing, until I heard the footsteps move away. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the handwriting shaky and uneven. It read, "Don't open the door. Don't let them in." I stared at the note for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to check out 6B for myself. The door was locked, but the keyhole was old and wide. I knelt down and peered inside. The apartment was dark, but I could make out Shape's furniture covered in sheets, boxes stacked against the walls. And then I saw something move. A shadow, tall and thin, gliding across the room. I jerked back, heart racing. That night, the noises were louder than ever. The footsteps pounded down the hall, stopping outside my door. The whispering was frantic, desperate. "Let me in. Please, let me in." I pressed my back against the door, clutching the note in my hand. Suddenly, the footsteps moved to 6B. I heard the door creak open and slam shut. The whispering stopped. The building was silent. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I called the landlord and demanded he check 6B. He agreed, sounding tired and irritated. We met in the hallway, and he unlocked the door. The apartment was empty, just as I'd seen through the keyhole. But the air was cold, and the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged marks, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. The landlord shrugged it off, said it was probably rats. He locked the door and told me to stop worrying. That night I heard the footsteps again. But this time They didn't stop outside my door. They walked right past, down the stairs, and out of the building. The whispering faded into the distance. I thought it was over. I started sleeping better, stopped wedging the chair under the door. But a few days later, I found another note under my door. This one was fresh, the ink still wet. It read, "Thank you for letting me out. I moved out the next day. I never went back." I took a job as a night security guard at Holloway Library, a massive stone building that sat in the oldest part of town. The library was beautiful during the day, with sunlight streaming through stained glass and the smell of old paper in the air. But at night, it was a different place. The halls were cold and silent, the shadows deep and heavy. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 o'clock a.m. I was the only one in the building. My job was simple: walk the floors every hour, check the doors and windows, and make sure no one was inside after closing. The first week was uneventful. I listened to music, read books, and tried not to let my imagination get the best of me. But on my 8th night, I noticed something strange. As I walked past the reading room, I saw a light on inside. I knew I'd turned off all the lights during my first round. I opened the door and found a single lamp glowing on a table. Next to it was an open book, its pages fluttering as if someone had just left. I turned off the lamp and closed the book, telling myself I'd just missed it earlier. The next night, the same thing happened. The lamp was on. The book opened to a different page. I checked the security cameras, but the feed was blank from midnight to 2 o'clock a.m. every night. I called the library manager, but she said the cameras were old and sometimes glitched. She told me not to worry, but I did worry. I started to feel watched. Sometimes as I walked the stacks, I'd hear footsteps behind me. I'd turn, but the aisles were empty. I'd hear the soft rustle of pages turning, the faint sound of someone whispering. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew stronger every night. One night, around 3 o'clock a.m., I heard a loud crash from the basement archives. I ran downstairs and found a row of shelves toppled over, books scattered across the floor. In the center of the mess was a single chair facing the wall. On the wall, someone had written a message in black ink: "Do not disturb the quiet." I called the police, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. The library manager was furious, accused me of making it up. She said if anything else happened, I'd be fired. I started carrying a flashlight and a heavy metal baton. I checked every door and window twice each night. But the disturbances continued. Lights flickered on and off. Books appeared in strange places. Once, I found a trail of open books leading from the children's section to the locked rare books room. The door was ajar, though I knew I'd locked it. Inside, I found a woman standing in the corner, her back to me. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, her hair pulled back tight. I called out, but she didn't move. I stepped closer and she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. When I looked up, she was gone. I tried to quit the next day, but the manager begged me to stay. She said she couldn't find anyone else willing to work nights. She offered me more money, so I agreed. But I started sleeping during the day, afraid to close my eyes at night. The worst night came a week later. I was doing my rounds when I heard the elevator ding. The elevator was supposed to be locked after hours. I ran to the lobby and saw the doors open. Inside stood the woman from the rare books room, her dress stained and torn. She stared at me, her mouth stretched into a silent scream. The lights flickered and went out. I heard footsteps all around me, the sound of books falling, pages tearing. I ran for the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned and saw dozens of figures moving through the stacks, their faces blank, their eyes empty. The lights snapped back on. The lobby was empty. The elevator doors were closed. I was alone. I quit the next morning. I never went back. Sometimes late at night I dream of the library. I see the woman in the elevator, her mouth open in a scream I can't hear. I wake up sweating, the sound of pages turning echoing in my ears. My uncle inherited a house on Willow Lane after my great-aunt passed away. The house was old, built in the 1920s, and sat at the end of a quiet street lined with overgrown trees. My uncle asked me to help clean it out before he put it up for sale. I agreed, thinking it would be a simple weekend job. The first time I saw the house, I felt uneasy. The windows were covered in grime, the porch sagged, and the front door stuck when I tried to open it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The furniture was covered in sheets and old photographs lined the walls. My uncle handed me a list of things to sort through and left to run errands. I started in the living room, boxing up books and knickknacks. Every so often, I'd hear a creak from upstairs or the sound of something shifting in another room. I told myself it was just the house settling. But as the afternoon wore on, the noises grew louder. I heard footsteps on the second floor, slow and deliberate, moving from room to room. I called out, thinking my uncle had come back, but no one answered. I went upstairs to check, but the hallway was empty. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. I opened each one, but found nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night I decided to stay in the house. My uncle had left to get supplies, and I didn't want to drive home in the dark. I set up a sleeping bag in the living room and tried to read, but the noises upstairs continued. Around midnight, I heard a door slam. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened as footsteps moved down the hall above me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept upstairs. The hallway was cold and the air felt heavy. I checked each room again, but they were all empty. As I turned to go back downstairs, I saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. It slipped into the last bedroom on the right. I followed, my hands shaking. The door was closed, but I could hear whispering inside. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard a woman's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, let me out, please." I opened the door, but the room was empty. The window was shut, the curtains drawn. I backed out and closed the door, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the woman's voice begging to be let out. In the morning, I found muddy footprints on the stairs, leading from the front door to the last bedroom. My shoes were clean and my uncle hadn't come back yet. I called him and told him what happened. He laughed it off, said the house was probably just haunted. He told me to finish packing up the kitchen and not to worry. I spent the day boxing up dishes and silverware, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I did catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping down the hall, a figure standing at the top of the stairs. I tried to focus on my work, but the feeling grew stronger as the day went on. That evening, my uncle returned. I told him about the footprints and the voice in the bedroom. He looked uneasy but tried to brush it off. He said my great-aunt had always been a little strange, that she used to talk to herself and lock herself in that room for hours at a time. We decided to check the bedroom together. The door was stuck, and it took both of us to force it open. Inside, the air was freezing. The walls were covered in scratches, deep gouges that ran from floor to ceiling. In the center of the room was an old wooden trunk, its lid slightly ajar. My uncle opened the trunk, and inside we found a stack of letters, all addressed to my great-aunt. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. The letters spoke of voices in the walls, of shadows that watched her while she slept. The last letter was different. The handwriting was frantic, the words barely legible. It read, "They won't let me leave. They watch me every night. Please, if you find this, don't stay after dark." We left the room and locked the door behind us. That night the noises were worse than ever. Doors slammed, footsteps pounded up and down the stairs, and the woman's voice echoed through the house, pleading to be let out. My uncle and I sat in the living room, too afraid to move. At dawn we packed our things and left. My uncle never sold the house. It still sits at the end of Willow Lane, empty and silent. Sometimes when I drive by, I see a shadow in the upstairs window, watching and waiting. I used to work late shifts at a hospital on the edge of the city. My only way home was the night bus, the number 17, which ran every hour after midnight. The bus was always nearly empty, just a few tired workers and the same old driver, a man named Mr. Harris. He never spoke much, just nodded when you got on and stared straight ahead as he drove through the dark, empty streets. One night, after a long shift, I caught the 2 a.m. bus. The city was silent, the streetlights flickering as we rolled past shuttered shops and empty lots. I sat near the back, headphones in, trying to stay awake. There were only 2 other passengers. A woman in a red coat who always got off at the same stop, and a man in a suit who never seemed to blink. About 10 minutes into the ride, the bus stopped at an intersection I didn't recognize. The doors hissed open, but no one got on. Mr. Harris waited, staring into the darkness outside. I took out my headphones and listened. The city was silent, but I thought I heard footsteps on the pavement. Then a man stepped onto the bus. He was tall and thin, with a pale face and sunken eyes. He wore a black coat and carried nothing with him. He didn't pay, just walked down the aisle and sat across from me. He stared straight ahead, never blinking, never moving. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't help it. There was something wrong about him, something that made my skin crawl. The bus started moving again, but the city outside looked different. The buildings were older, the streets narrower. I checked my phone, but I had no signal. The woman in the red coat got up and moved to the front of the bus, sitting right behind Mr. Harris. The man in the suit stared out the window, his reflection warped in the glass. The new passenger never moved. He just sat there, staring at nothing. I tried to ignore him, but every time I glanced his way, I saw his eyes fixed on me, unblinking and cold. We'd passed another stop, but no one got on or off. The city outside was empty, the streetlights flickering and dying as we passed. I started to feel dizzy, like the air was getting thinner. I looked at the other passengers, but they didn't seem to notice anything strange. Then, the man in the suit stood up and walked to the front of the bus. He leaned down and whispered something to Mr. Harris, who nodded without looking away from the road. The woman in the red coat turned and looked at me, her eyes wide and frightened. She mouthed something I couldn't hear. The bus slowed to a stop in the middle of a deserted street. The doors opened, and the man in the suit stepped off. He didn't look back. The woman in the red coat followed, glancing at me as she left. I thought about getting off too, but something told me to stay. The doors closed, and the bus started moving again. The city outside was gone, replaced by endless rows of dark trees. The only light came from the bus's headlights, cutting through the fog that had settled over the road. I looked at the pale man in the black coat. He was still staring straight ahead, but now he was smiling. His teeth were sharp and too many for his mouth. I tried to move to the front of the bus, but my legs wouldn't work. I felt frozen, trapped in my seat. Mr. Harris kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road. I tried to call out to him, but my voice wouldn't work. The pale man turned to look at me, his eyes black and empty. He leaned closer, his smile growing wider. The bus stopped again, this time in the middle of the woods. The doors opened, and the pale man stood up. He turned to me and whispered, "This is your stop." His voice was cold and hollow, echoing in my head. I tried to move, but I couldn't. The man reached out and touched my shoulder. His hand was ice cold. Suddenly I could move again. I stumbled to the front of the bus, desperate to get away. Mr. Harris looked at me, his eyes empty and lifeless. I stepped off the bus and into the fog. The doors closed behind me and the bus drove away, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. I stood alone in the woods, the fog pressing in on all sides. I tried to find my way back to the road, but every path led deeper into the trees. I wandered for hours, calling for help, but no one answered. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. The number 17 bus pulled up, its doors opening with a hiss. Mr. Harris sat behind the wheel, the woman in the red coat, and the man in the suit sitting behind him. The pale man was gone. I got on the bus, and Mr. Harris nodded. The doors closed, and we drove back into the city. When I got off at my stop, the city was just as I remembered it. The streetlights were bright, the buildings familiar. I never saw the pale man again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the hiss of bus doors outside my window, and I wonder if the number 17 is waiting for me to take another ride. My first real job was as a caretaker for an old boarding school that had been closed for years. The building was huge, with 3 floors, a basement, and a bell tower that hadn't rung in decades. The school sat on a hill outside town, surrounded by woods and a rusted iron fence. My job was to keep the place from falling apart until the owners decided what to do with it. The first day, the property manager handed me a ring of keys. Most were old and heavy, their labels worn away. He pointed out the main ones: front door, boiler room, staff office, and a small brass key with a red tag. "Don't use this one," he said. "It's for the east wing. That part's off limits." Too many accidents over the years. He didn't explain further, just handed me a flashlight and left. The first week was quiet. I swept the halls, checked the windows, and made sure the pipes didn't freeze. The building creaked and groaned at night, but I got used to it. Sometimes I'd find doors open that I knew I'd closed, or lights on in rooms I hadn't entered. I blamed it on drafts and faulty wiring. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the trees, and rain battered the windows. I was in the caretaker's apartment, reading, when I heard a loud crash from the east wing. I remembered the manager's warning, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the key ring and flashlight and headed down the hall. The east wing was colder than the rest of the building. The air felt heavy, and the smell of mold was strong. I found the door at the end of the hall, the one with the old brass lock. I hesitated, then used the red-tagged key. The lock turned with a loud click. Inside, the hallway was lined with old classrooms. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor was littered with broken desks and chairs. I walked past the first few rooms, shining my light inside. Most were empty, but one had a pile of old uniforms in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. At the end of the hall was a door marked Headmaster's Office. The wood was warped, and the handle was cold to the touch. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, except for a faint glow coming from the fireplace. I moved closer and saw that the fire was burning, even though there was no wood or ash. I heard a whisper behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was thin and brittle like dry leaves. I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut on its own. The fire in the fireplace flared, casting long shadows on the walls. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, filling the room. I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and shuffling. Something pressed against the door from the other side, rattling the handle. I pounded on the wood, shouting for help, but the only answer was the sound of nails scratching down the length of the door. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it flickered and died. I stood in the dark, listening to the whispers swirl around me. I felt something cold brush against my arm, then a hand close around my wrist. The grip was icy and strong. I tried to pull away, but it held tight. A voice hissed in my ear, "You let us out." The grip loosened and I stumbled back. The door creaked open and I ran into the hallway. The air was thick with fog, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I ran for the main hall, but the building had changed. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me in circles. I heard footsteps behind me, dozens of them, echoing off the walls. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, darting from doorway to doorway. I tried every door, but they were all locked. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and frantic. "Let us out. Let us out." I finally found a staircase and ran down to the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of earth was strong. I heard water dripping somewhere in the dark. I followed the sound, hoping to find a way out. Instead, I found a row of old lockers, their doors hanging open. Inside each locker was a nameplate, the name scratched out. At the end of the row was a heavy metal door. I tried the handle, and it swung open with a groan. On the other side was a small room, empty except for a single chair and a pile of old keys on the floor. I recognized the red-tagged key on top of the pile. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was a boy maybe 12 years old, dressed in an old-school uniform. His eyes were dark and hollow, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. He pointed at the keys and whispered, "You have to lock the door. Don't let them out." I grabbed the red-tagged key and ran back up the stairs. The building was silent now, the whispers gone. I reached the east wing and slammed the door shut, locking it with the brass key. The air grew warmer and the lights flickered back on. I left the school that night and never returned. The owners tore it down a year later. Sometimes when I walk past the empty lot, I hear whispers on the wind, and I wonder if I really locked the door or if something followed me out. I worked as an overnight producer at a small-town radio station. The building was old, tucked behind a strip mall, and the night shift was always lonely. Most nights, I was the only one there, running pre-recorded shows and reading the weather every hour. The only light came from the red on-air sign and the glow of the control board. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was halfway through my shift when the phone rang. The caller ID was blank. I answered, expecting a prank or a wrong number. Instead, a voice whispered, "You're not alone." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, heart pounding. I tried to shake it off, but a few minutes later, the phone rang again. Same whisper, same words. I checked the security cameras. The parking lot was empty, the hallway dark. I told myself it was just a bored kid messing with me, but then the lights in the hallway flickered. I heard footsteps outside the studio door, slow and heavy. I called out, but no one answered. I locked the door and turned up the volume on the monitors, trying to drown out the sound. But the footsteps grew louder, closer. I heard someone breathing on the other side of the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed the station manager, but the call wouldn't go through. The phone lines were dead. Suddenly, the on-air light flickered and went out. The studio plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I sat in the dark, listening to the footsteps circle the room. Then, the phone rang again. I answered, my hands shaking. This time the voice was different. It was my own voice, whispering, "Let me in." I dropped the phone and backed away from the door. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I waited, barely breathing, until the sun came up. When the morning DJ arrived, the lights snapped back on, the phones worked, and the on-air sign glowed red again. I tried to explain what happened, but he just laughed and said the building was haunted. I quit that day. Sometimes late at night, I hear my own voice on the radio, whispering words I never said. After college, I took a job as a night orderly at a psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The building was massive, with long, echoing corridors and high barred windows. Most of the hospital was modern, but one wing, the oldest part, had been closed for years. Staff called it the locked ward. No one went in, and the doors were always chained shut. My supervisor, Mr. Larkin, told me to ignore any noises from that side of the building. Old pipes, rats, wind, he said. Don't let your imagination get the best of you. I tried to listen, but every night, as I made my rounds, I heard things from the locked ward. Sometimes it was footsteps, sometimes a faint tapping, sometimes a woman's voice humming a lullaby. One night, a patient named Mrs. Dorsey refused to sleep. She kept pointing at the window, whispering, "She's watching. She wants to come back." I tried to calm her, but she wouldn't stop staring at the darkened wing across the courtyard. Later, as I checked the doors, I found the chain on the locked ward hanging loose. The padlock was open, swinging from the handle. I radioed Mr. Larkin, but he didn't answer. I should have left it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale. My flashlight beam danced over peeling paint, broken beds, and old wheelchairs. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps. I walked down the hall, passing empty rooms. In one, I saw a child's drawing on the wall, a stick figure with long black hair, standing in front of a barred window. At the end of the hall was a heavy door marked seclusion. The handle was cold, and the door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair and a cracked mirror. I stepped closer and saw words scratched into the glass. "Let me out." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the handle wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and I heard footsteps in the hall. A woman's voice whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I pressed my ear to the door and heard someone breathing on the other side. I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The footsteps moved away and the whispering faded. I was alone in the dark, the only sound my own heartbeat. I tried my radio again, but it was dead. After what felt like hours, the door creaked open. Mr. Larkin stood in the hall, his face pale. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said. He led me out, locking the door behind us. He didn't say another word. The next night, Mrs. Dorsey was gone. The nurses said she'd been transferred, but no one knew where. The chain on the locked ward was back in place. The padlock rusted shut. I never went near that wing again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a woman humming a lullaby, and I wonder if she ever left. My family owns a small cabin deep in the woods, right on the edge of a lake surrounded by tall pines. We only visited in the summer, but last October I decided to spend a weekend there alone. I wanted peace and quiet, a break from the city and my job. The air was crisp, the leaves had turned, and the lake was still as glass. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, read a book, and listened to the wind in the trees. But as the sun set, a thick fog rolled in from the water, swallowing the shoreline. The woods grew silent, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of water against the dock. Around midnight, I heard a splash. I looked out the window and saw ripples spreading across the lake. I told myself it was just a fish or a beaver, but the ripples were too big, too slow. I watched for a while but saw nothing else. The next morning I found wet footprints on the dock. They were long and narrow, with only 4 toes. They led from the water to the edge of the woods, then disappeared. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. That afternoon, I went for a walk along the shore. The fog still clung to the water, and the woods were eerily quiet. I found more footprints in the mud, leading to a small cove I'd never explored. The air grew colder as I followed the trail. I heard a low humming, almost like a song, coming from the water. I reached the cove and saw something floating just beneath the surface. It looked like a bundle of sticks, but as I got closer, I saw it was a doll, its face carved from wood, its eyes painted black. It was tied to a stone with a length of old rope. I pulled it from the water and felt a chill run through me. The doll's mouth was open, as if it was screaming. I left the cove and hurried back to the cabin. That night, the fog was thicker than ever. I locked the doors and windows, but the humming grew louder, echoing across the lake. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's face. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, dragging footsteps, like something heavy was being pulled across the boards. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. Through the fog, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the dock. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black and empty, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. The figure turned and looked at me. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The humming grew louder, filling the cabin. I heard the footsteps move from the dock to the porch, then to the door. The handle rattled, and I heard a voice whisper, "Let me in." I pressed my back against the door, holding it shut. The whispering grew frantic, the voice rising to a wail. The window shook, and the lights flickered. I closed my eyes and waited for it to end. When I opened my eyes, the sun was rising. The fog had lifted, and the lake was calm. I found muddy footprints on the porch, leading back to the water. The doll was gone. I packed my things and left that morning. I haven't been back to the cabin since. Sometimes when I hear foghorns in the city, I remember the humming on the lake and wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door. My grandparents' farm sat on the edge of a wide, empty field. When I was a kid, I spent every summer there, helping with chores and exploring the woods. The field was always off limits after dark. My grandfather said it was because of coyotes, but I never saw any. The real reason, I learned much later, was something else. Last fall, after my grandparents passed, I returned to the farm to help my parents pack up the house. The first night, I sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the field. The grass was tall and golden, swaying in the wind. As the sky darkened, I noticed shapes moving in the field, tall, thin figures, almost blending in with the grass. I thought it was a trick of the light. After dinner, I went to bed early. Around midnight, I woke to a tapping on my window. I sat up, heart pounding. The window faced the field, and in the moonlight, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the grass. It was tall, with long arms and a head that seemed too small for its body. It didn't move, just watched the house. I closed the curtains and tried to sleep, but the tapping continued, slow and steady. I finally got up and looked again. The figure was gone, but now there were 3 shapes standing in the field, closer to the house. The next morning I told my parents. My dad looked uneasy, but said nothing. My mom just told me to stay inside after dark. I spent the day packing boxes and trying to forget what I'd seen. That evening, as the sun set, I watched the field from the kitchen window. The shapes were back, moving slowly through the grass. I counted 5 of them, all the same, tall, thin, and silent. They stopped at the edge of the yard and stood perfectly still. After dark, the tapping started again. This time it came from the back door. I crept down the hall and peeked through the peephole. A pale, thin hand pressed against the glass, fingers too long and jointed in the wrong places. I backed away, heart racing. I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and dragging. The doorknob rattled, and a voice whispered, "Let us in." The voice was thin and high, almost childlike. I ran to my parents' room, but they were asleep, oblivious to the noise. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the hallway, listening to the tapping and whispering. At dawn, the noises stopped. I looked outside and saw the shapes retreating into the field, melting into the grass as the sun rose. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt outside the back door. They were long and narrow, with only 3 toes. I showed my dad, but he just shook his head and told me not to worry. That night, the shapes came closer. I watched from the upstairs window as they circled the house, their heads turning in unison to follow my movements. I closed the curtains and tried to block out the sound of their voices, whispering in a language I didn't understand. At midnight, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy. I locked myself in the bathroom and waited, listening to the sound of hands scraping against the door. When the sun rose, the noises stopped. The power came back on and the house was empty. My parents never saw or heard anything, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. We left the farm that day. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the shapes standing in the field, watching us go. I haven't been back since. Sometimes when I see tall grass swaying in the wind, I remember the watchers in the field and wonder if they're still waiting. When I started my new job at the city archives, I was excited. The building was old, with marble floors and high ceilings, and the basement was a maze of locked doors and forgotten rooms. My supervisor, Mr. Finch, gave me a tour on my first day. He showed me the main storage areas, the break room, and the emergency exits. As we walked down one of the basement corridors, I noticed a door at the very end. It was plain, painted the same color as the wall, but unlike the others, it had no number or label. I asked about it, but Mr. Finch just shook his head. "That room's not in use. Don't worry about it." He moved on quickly, and I didn't press him. For weeks, I worked late, sorting files and scanning old documents. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps echoing in the basement when I was alone, or the sound of a door closing softly somewhere down the hall. I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the cleaning crew upstairs. One night I stayed later than usual. The building was silent, the only light coming from my desk lamp. As I packed up to leave, I heard a faint tapping, like someone knocking on a door. It was coming from the end of the hall, the door with no number. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing on the tile. The tapping stopped as I got closer. I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold. I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. I pressed my ear to the door and heard a voice whisper, "Please, let me out." The voice was thin and desperate, barely more than a breath. I backed away, heart pounding. I left the basement and went home, but I couldn't sleep. The next day, I asked Mr. Finch again about the door. He looked tired and wouldn't meet my eyes. "Some things are better left alone," he said. "Just do your work and stay out of that hallway after hours." But the tapping continued every night. Sometimes it was soft, sometimes frantic. Sometimes I heard voices pleading, crying, whispering my name. I started leaving work earlier, but one night, a storm hit and I was stuck in the building. The power flickered, and the emergency lights cast long shadows down the hall. I heard the tapping again, louder than ever. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the end of the hall. The door was shaking, the knob rattling. I heard voices on the other side, dozens of them, all whispering, "Let us out. Please, let us out." I ran back to my office and locked the door. The tapping echoed through the walls, growing louder and more desperate. I called security, but no one answered. I sat at my desk, listening to the voices, until the sun came up and the noises stopped. The next morning, I found scratches on the inside of my office door, as if someone or something had tried to get in. I told Mr. Finch I was quitting. He just nodded as if he'd been expecting it. I never went back to the archives. Sometimes late at night, I dream of that door at the end of the hall, and the voices calling my name. I wonder what's behind it and if anyone will ever let them out. Thank you for listening to these stories. Whether you believe in ghosts, shadows, or things that watch from the dark, remember sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't explain. Lock your doors, check your windows, and if you hear a whisper late at night, maybe it's best not to answer. Good night.